Professor Lowande, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to do so. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Why don't we start with your background? Where did you start off? Sort of the arc of your career so far, and then where you are now and what you're doing.
Yeah, that'll be quick. I'm at the University of Michigan right now in the political science department and at the Ford School of Public Policy. As far as the arc of my career, I sort of stumbled into this. I got my PhD at the University of Virginia in government. When I started graduate school, I had very little idea of what political science was, and even what academics did. Right, that there, nobody in my family graduated college, so I didn't know that there was this sort of class of people who are paid to study politics and do self-directed research and self-directed studies, and that seemed like a pretty good deal to me. So I've always been fascinated by government in general, and through basically the support of a lot of different mentors and a lot more luck, I ended up here, and happy ever since.
So what you mentioned, you've always been interested in government. Was there something specific that brought you there? Even as an undergrad, it sounds like you were already looking at this area. What was it that drew you to this space?
I was interested in questions of accountability, specifically as it relates to bureaucracy and the administrative state, right? The idea that we have a couple of million people in this country who are employed by the federal government. They make decisions that are ostensibly apolitical, but really political by implication. And how and when they are going to be accountable is a function of the politicians who are in charge of overseeing them. So I read a lot in undergraduate school that sort of nibbled at the edges of those kinds of questions. But I got more interested in that and wanted to study it more directly in graduate school.
Got it. And so you went to graduate school, and now you're working as a professor. What is the broad themes of your research currently? If we talk, broadly speaking, then later on we'll dial into the Congress stuff. But overall, what are your directions?
Sure. Yeah, and they relate to the things that I was motivated on by early on. I have a couple of streams of research. One is on Congress, focusing mostly on congressional oversight, which I suppose we'll talk a lot more about later. But I also have research about the presidency, about local bureaucratic institutions as well. And I sort of consider myself, along with a set of other people's, kind of a separation of powers scholar, right? I'm lucky in that, I'm mostly interested in the interaction between political institutions, and our system happens to be one that sets them up to fight with each other constantly. So pretty much everything I've written has something to do with that in one way or another.
Got it. Let's start on the Congress stuff, and why don't we go into more detail about some of your earlier work, I guess, around the appropriations budgeting process. Can you talk about what did you do in that area? What questions did you come in with? What did you find at the end when it came to that work?
The early work on appropriations, which I did with another graduate student at the time named Andrew Clark, actually was sparked by interacting with former congressional staffers who taught classes at UVA. One of them was a longtime appropriator, and he explained to us, and he worked in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate for decades. And he was explaining to us sort of how the sausage was made on the appropriation side of things. And the things that he was explaining to us were very different from the sort of textbook idea of, the authorizing committees authorize some buckets of potential funding, and then the appropriators fill those buckets every year. And what he was describing to us seemed very, very different. What they were instead doing was siphoning from those buckets and then spending the money elsewhere, sort of in a way trying to evade some of the discretionary spending caps that have existed for many decades now. So, I mean, the specific results of that paper aren't, something I'd, run away screaming from the hilltop, but the main takeaway that I at least got from it is that in order to study these institutions, you really have to talk to the people who have worked there. And oftentimes the sort of textbook way that we think of these institutions running doesn't play out in practice for reasons that you can't really see on paper. They're related to norms. They're related to the strategic behavior of the members. So yeah, that early work, I've not done work on appropriations since, but it certainly informed almost everything I've done, even though it's not topically related.
So can you explain in more detail, how did it actually work? So the author in the case that you're describing, there would be authorizing committees, they would authorize X, and then the Senate, the appropriators would, pretend that it was that money, but it would actually be allocated for some other purpose.
Yeah, so the two types of spending, mandatory and discretionary. There are discretionary spending caps, and a growing proportion of the federal budget, as you probably know, has been taken up by mandatory spending. So the authorizers are in effect shrinking the amount of discretionary spending that those appropriators have to move around. So what the appropriators were doing, and this was particularly prevalent in the area of agriculture, where there are a lot of mandatory programs that look kind of like discretionary programs. So the appropriators thought that the authorizers were moving in on their jurisdiction, and they would dip into those mandatory programs, siphon away from them, and then spend it somewhere else in order to increase discretionary spending elsewhere.
So, the motivations to do this kind of activity, was it sort of turf defense, or was it really that, that money probably was better allocated some other way than had originally been intended, or was it, all pork? They just wanted it in their district and they reallocate some resource back to their district. What was the motivations to do that, kind of work?
I think it really was a kind of jurisdictional argument about, the idea that you could sort of insulate a program by turning it into something that was mandatory, and thereby guarantee it for years to come. I think that's mostly what the disagreement was about. I think since then they've had an agreement that they've come to an agreement that prevents them from having to do this, so that the term for this practice was changes in mandatory program spending, which is short for CHIMPS, which is a fun acronym, but I'm not sure how many CHIMPS there are in the appropriations bills annually every year now.
So did any of this work that you were doing give you any thoughts or insights about the concept of authorizations versus appropriations to begin with? Obviously we have a budget process. Well, we have a theoretical budget process where there's a budget committee, and then there's authorizations and appropriations. And clearly it's broken down completely, but there is this fundamental notion of authorizations versus appropriations. Some people say that shouldn't exist. It should just be one committee with both powers. Did you get any appreciation for it should be one way or another, or what the pluses and minuses were of the existing system?
I guess what I acquired a fundamental appreciation for is that even what discretionary or mandatory means, right? The distinction between those things is largely a function of what everybody in Congress can agree on, right? They define that themselves, and they push the boundaries of what those definitions are in ways that further their own interests. Um, and, even something like the discretionary spending caps, which are there, that creates a problem if you want more spending, and if the pie is shrinking. So what do? You respond to it strategically. And to me, it mostly taught me that these rules themselves are endogenous to the preferences of the members. And when they really want to, and there's enough interest in doing so, they will change them, even if they're not changed on paper.
So it sounds like you didn't come out with a very strong thought about authorizations versus appropriations as concepts, but you did come away with the sense that mandatory and discretionary was an sort of a fuzzy boundary. Do you think that should be just, I mean, these two categories are artificial. I mean, ultimately, this is all money one way or another. Right. And putting some of it in a longer term decision-making framework versus a shorter term decision framework is also kind of an arbitrary cutoff. Do you think it should be eliminated, or keep it as it is, or come up with a better definition?
I'll stay safe and say it's fine as is, Matt.
Got it. So in terms of the budget process, did you touch on any of the top-down elements from, where the appropriators are given their buckets by the budget committee? And was there anything there that you had questions about or found in your research?
So that was part of that paper. The main explanatory variable for when the appropriators go after those mandatory funds is their 302B. I think it's called a 302B allocation. So what the budget committee gives them to spend determines whether or not they're going to go try to find money elsewhere in order to supplement that.
So if they gave them more money, they might leave it alone. If they didn't, they might try to creatively get money from wherever they could, which in this case sounds like there was a pathway. Right,
exactly.
And so to my question earlier about where they wanted to spend the money, obviously it's jurisdictional, but I'm curious, was it motivated by what people would typically consider pork? Were those programs going to, the appropriators' home districts in some way, or was it just mainly, regular run-of-the-mill programs that weren't directly related to any personal interest?
I can't think of specific examples off the top of my head. What we mostly studied was what they were taking money away from. But all of the money that they took, mind you, right, and we were studying agriculture, was spent on other agriculture programs. So, and all the money that they're taking away from too was agriculture programs. So you'd have to think that, some of the same people are related to the authorizing committees. So they would have pretty specific knowledge of where the money was being shifted. I'm not sure if they were, quote, pork barrel spending or not.
So where were they taking it from? Since you looked at that side of it, was it stuff that wouldn't make the news, or was it, how did they target where they were taking?
Yeah, definitely not stuff that would make the news. We're talking about things like, research programs related to raising sheep. And the big one in the Justice Department was the justice people used to siphon from the Crime Victims Fund, which is a fund that the Justice Department maintains. They essentially, it's a fund that is made up of, usually comes from the sale of assets from things that they confiscate from criminals. So the appropriators would siphon from that and then spend it on other justice programs.
Very interesting. All right. Well, maybe we move on then to the oversight work that you're doing. Why don't you talk a little bit about what, overall, what are you doing in oversight? What questions do you have? What have you found so far?
Sure. So a lot of my work are early work from both my dissertation and early papers that have since been published, is about the specific tools that Congress uses to oversee the executive branch. So the big questions in this literature that are, at least from the researcher's point of view, is what determines how vigorously Congress is going to perform this job, because they clearly don't do it evenly across time. Sometimes they go into more depth. So what are the determinants? What incentivizes members to oversee the executive branch? So I have an early paper on hearings, which is more of a historical paper. It's basically shows that once senators were popularly elected, they started more vigorously investigating the executive branch under divided government, which is when the majority was controlled by the opposition party, opposition relative to the president. But that same pattern doesn't exist in the House. The House is always more vigorously investigated an opposition party president. That paper was on one kind of tool, which is hearings, which I'm doing more work on now. But the other thing that I find interesting, or have found interesting, is the things that are less visible that Congress does, not necessarily on a week-to-week basis, but really on a daily basis, and also not collectively. Usually, it's individual offices. So, from on any given day, a congressional office might contact an agency for constituent-related concerns that look a lot like oversight. Like if your constituent has had a problem with an agency, if an interest group in your district doesn't like something that an agency is doing, the member will call them up or write them a letter. Committees do this as well. They'll put together a request for information directly to agencies. And all of this contact sort of goes on behind closed doors. It's not listed on congress.gov. Members don't talk about it that much, though sometimes you'll see them boasting. And this is the stuff that's much more frequent than an oversight hearing or an oversight report. That kind of thing takes a lot of time and energy for them to do. But this is kind of the daily work, and it's happening constantly. So I have a couple papers on that topic. I collected a lot of data by going to the agencies themselves, because you can't, FOIA members of Congress or ask them for this. And I found a couple of interesting things. The first and most important thing is when you look at this oversight that goes on behind closed doors, the patterns are differ quite a bit from the public oversight that we see. So that pattern in hearings that you see, where there appears to be a kind of strong partisan incentive for Congress to more vigorously oversee an opposition party president, doesn't happen behind closed doors, right? So when the cameras aren't rolling, they appear to be less partisan, less confrontational. These letters are much more, straight to the point. Here's some information, or we want this kind of information. What are you doing on this issue? What can you do for us? So that was important. And then secondly, I also found that the agencies themselves are really seem to be, if you look at the central tendencies of these letters in the aggregate, they seem to be acutely aware of the relative status and rank of members of Congress. So if we look at patterns of responsiveness, or how quickly they respond to members, they seem to prioritize members of the majority party. They seem to prioritize committee leadership. and party leaders in general, and agencies that tend to have leadership that are more political, meaning more political appointees, tend to prioritize members of the president's party as opposed to the opposition. So that tells us a couple of things. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more oversight going on than we see in public. It might be a little bit less political, but there's still strategic behavior going on both sides, especially on the agency side.
So to me, this is very interesting because you could call it oversight, but the first thing that comes to my mind is favors, right?
Right.
Is it oversight or is it favors? What's the nature of these communications? Is it, the office didn't open on time in XYZ city, or is it this particular veteran didn't get their benefits, or, what's the nature of these interactions? And how do you classify oversight versus some other kind of classification?
So it's all those things. It could be pure insight, right? Depending upon who you talk to. I've had people say, constituency service, it's a kind of oversight. But so these certainly include that. It also includes comments on regulations. It includes, I saw the president sign this executive order. How are you carrying this executive order out? So a lot of times it's status updates. Sometimes it's favors. Sometimes it's requests for information or just help with a constituent. But I like your use of the term favors because, I mean, it points out the other important thing about this, which is that, like the congressional institutions, this mostly operates on a system of norms, unseen norms, right? Because there's nothing, the agencies aren't explicitly obligated to respond to these things, but they have whole offices that are dedicated to doing so because it's in their interest to do so. There was actually a controversy during the Trump administration where the Leg Affairs office in an agency was essentially asking members of Congress to stop doing this and instead just file FOIA requests like a typical citizen would. And a bipartisan group of senators actually stood up and said, no, that's not how this works. This is, we like being able to send these letters even and make these calls, even if it's informal, because, those norms are beneficial to both the agencies and the members.
So for me, this concept of an individual member, individual senator or their office calling up an agency for a particular issue for a particular constituent, to me, that's kind of surprising, right? I mean, Congress is supposed to be in the business of legislating, right? And overseeing should be, at least in my conception, a kind of a systematic review of all the operations of an agency. And, you, of course, part of that, you get feedback from people who have used the agency, people have, but this seems much more like, it's constituent service on a retail level.
Right.
That, and I'm assuming each of these how many of them, I guess, are related to a particular individual compared, servicing a particular individual in a constituency versus some kind of more overarching or systematic problem?
Yeah, so it depends on the agency that we're talking about. But what you're asking brings to mind the fact that it's not always it's not zero sum between those two options, the systematic review or individual help. So there's good example is the veteran, the VA wait time scandal. So, so there's a couple of VAs years ago who were essentially inventing, fudging the wait time that they were giving veterans, and then CNN and I think a couple other news outlets, does this expose that shows that a bunch of veterans had died while waiting for medical care. And those VA medical centers had falsified those records. Now, if you look at the VA's correspondence log at that time, you will see in it many members of Congress contacting the VA Sludge Affairs Office about concerns over wait time in advance of the scandal breaking, right? So there's this signal, aggregate signal that you can detect from the members of Congress pursuing the interests of an individual constituent. So I think that, you know, there's positives and negatives to this. I certainly see it seems sort of odd that members of Congress have sort of de facto become a help office for the federal government. That seems bizarre to me. And, you know, doing something more systematic might be good. But at the same time, you know, that's a form of feedback that they're getting. And I think the real question is how do you aggregate and, you know, more efficiently process that feedback so that you can detect those signals?
Yeah, I mean, the example that you just described to me sounds more like a failure than a success, because it seems like retail wise, you have the individual members doing something uncoordinated, and then,
Right.
you know, whereas a better situation would have been to have an independent group, that was measuring the wait times, not relying on the agency itself, has an independent, aggregated kind of information stream. And
Right.
that would have been the solution, would have been appropriate for Congress to have anticipated and executed, right? Rather than being the hero that's going to help somebody jump in line, right? To get into the hospital. So part of my concern, or my curiosity and concern around this kind of concept of constituent service, is that ultimately it seems like members are able to be the hero to a lot of these individuals, but then there's an incentive not to create a systemic solution to these problems. It's to continue to be the hero rather than to find a solution for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable concern. And I certainly I would never call the VA wait time scandal a success story of governance on any side. I think more what I'm saying is that those individual signals have the potential to do the kind of thing that you're talking about. I don't think Congress or the Ledge Affairs Office at the VA is set up to do that at present time. But yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to think of an alternative, right? Can you imagine, telling members of Congress, yeah, when your constituent answers the call, just tell them to take a hike. You have bigger fish to fry. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the conception of representation, at least to me, is around legislation and oversight of the agencies, not personalized services. If I'm frustrated with an agency, but I think that's certainly not the view of a lot of people, and definitely of the members themselves, who really like this constituent service aspect of their job.
Or the constituents too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk then about the concept of oversight, really broadly speaking. So there's this notion of investigative oversight where it's like it's stealing, it's corruption, it's gross negligence. It's there's this whole realm that's very exciting and gets in the news.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this kind of systematic oversight of the executive branch where, Congress passes a law. Is the law being executed? Right? That's sort of question number one. And
Right.
Overseeing whether that happens or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of law out there. Is it actually being executed? And the second question then on top of that is, okay, if it's being executed, is it executed as we intended, right? And a third level above that is is it achieving the original objective of the legislation? That's kind of another layer of oversight on top of that.
Yeah.
And, Congress doesn't seem to be doing that in any way in a systematic basis. I mean, when you think about oversight, is that how you conceive of it? Or you have what's your approach to thinking through oversight and whether Congress is doing its job or not, or how it should do its job?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're a little bit more normative and aspirational in the way that you think about this than I do, just because of I'm forced to think about it in more abstract and in some ways more boring ways. I think that, there's some of the existing institutions like, annual appropriations hearings. That's a form of systematic oversight where they have to account for the way they've spent money and justify their future. Now, some of it is quite routine, and some of it ought to be routine. But ideally, that in some cases, some agencies, this is their only what you would call an oversight hearing. Reauthorization bills, I think, is another touchstone or point where people, I think, talk about some of the more higher purposes that you're talking about. Is this legislation achieving its original goal? But yeah, I don't think of terms in oversight of either of those things. I think of oversight in a much more basic way, which is Congress able to relieve its natural asymmetry of information between itself and the executive branch? For better or worse, and I think most people in your series would probably say for worse, Congress has really limited itself in terms of the available expertise that it has around, and the number of objective sources of information about what's going on in the executive branch. So, I think of any kind of oversight that seeks to extract some sort of private information that an agency or the president has, I would call that activity oversight.
So one thing I find interesting is that typically when we talk about oversight, it's more about Congress getting information from the executive, right? In some way. But when we talk, like even the example that we described with the VA, right? I mean, you could use a third party to get that information. You don't need to get it from the executive agency. You could get a consulting firm, right, or a survey company for not much money, right, to execute an ongoing quarterly survey of the VA, people on the VA, and say, how long is your wait time? Or how's your satisfaction with the VA? You don't need to get that information from the VA itself. You can use third parties to collect the information from all the stakeholders if you want it. So that's always surprises me that oversight is framed in this notion of getting, or FOIAs or whatever, getting information from the executive and trying to wring it out of them, when a lot of the times the answer can be very cheaply bought off the public market or just created by contracting someone. So can you talk through that? I mean, does this happen? Is it a path Congress should take rather than go through all this trouble to talk to the executive?
I think that what you're talking about exists in some form in the GAO. What it is not doing that you're describing is something that's more systematic, because when GAO investigates, it is very episodic. They do very good work. They are an essential source of information and they have talented investigators, but it is episodic because it's based on requests from members and others. And it takes a long time. So, I mean, I agree with you that Congress, to do something more systematic, there would have to be something that was more permanent and institutional that monitored this information. I don't even think it has to be a third party. I think that you could shift some of the information gathering functions of the executive branch as they are now, places like the BLS and other information gathering agencies, and just make them instrumentalities of Congress, so that they're right. There are some bureaus in the executive branch. There's no conceivable reason that they need to be under the direct purview of the president. So, and if that was the case, then there's no reason, there's no need to do any kind of oversight. The information's there within Congress itself.
Yeah, I think, talking to people directly who engage with the agencies would seem to be a good way to get a lot of insight. And the way you described earlier, which always concerns me, is this kind of retail version
Right.
going through the member of Congress. I mean, why does the member learn about a problem with the VA through people contacting his office rather than some group that's the whole full-time job is to collect people's experience with the federal government and its pathologies, right?
Right.
And that being aggregated and displayed in some way to the Congress as a whole to take legislative action rather than this kind of retail backdoor to try to solve problems.
Right. I mean, and it gets back to individual incentives, right? This is, if it's more episodic and it becomes more retail, then it's within the individual interest of the member. So
do you think that, I'm curious because of the volume and the time used by the member to do this constituent service work, and some of it may be useful for system-wide kind of legislative activity, but obviously a lot of it's one-off solutions for a person, right? Do you think those activities have a major impact on re-elections? I mean, they must, otherwise why would they do it? In a cynical world, I guess you could say that. But, do you think is it a statistically important enough group of people that it would sway an election one way or another?
I would guess no, in general. But the quick follow-up is, if you asked the members or the staff, they would probably say yes. So it probably doesn't matter whether it has a causal impact on their reelection or not, because they believe it is important, and that they may not even believe that it has a causal impact. They must just believe it's the right thing to do because they're there to serve their constituents, right? Which is perfectly reasonable. What I have found in my research is that it is, and research with Molly Ritchie and Aaron Louderback, is the nature of their service to many degrees reflects the nature of their constituency. So you see members with lots of veterans in their districts do more veteran constituency service, right? So I think it really is them sort of reproducing what they believe the interests of their constituents are, even if the annual volume of cases that they're able to deal with probably isn't likely able to touch more than a couple thousand people.
So then, I mean, if it's constituent driven, if this oversight activity, this informal oversight activity that you've done some work in, if it's primarily constituent driven, does that mean that there's a whole swath of the government that doesn't have this informal oversight because your average person doesn't interact with it? I don't know, maybe USTR or whatever it is, some agencies that are more remote from the person's daily life. Do they get a lot less calls? And so in theory, there's a lot less oversight?
Absolutely. Yes. There's definitely going to be the attention is not evenly distributed. It's not, distributed as on a per dollar basis or any kind of weighted basis. It's definitely a function of the agencies that are more public facing and of more interest to people.
So our only hopes there are the hearings and the authorizations.
Yes, sure.
Well, let's move on to the other area of oversight I'd like to discuss, which is oversight of the regulators. I mean, you could make an argument, like you mentioned earlier, you could bring all the regulators over to Congress and Congress could do all the regulation. But for now, I think most people don't advocate for that. They say leave it in the executive branch, just have to oversee it, what's happening, or have some kind of you have to oversee what the regulators are doing. So can you talk about what you've done in that area, overseeing the regulators?
Yeah, so the work I have on oversight of regulation is with Rachel Potter, who you've talked to before. It's really about, so we classify oversight into a couple of different quadrants. The important one for this is that we're looking at oversight that happens after the agency has sort of revealed what it's going to do. So they started a notice and comment process. We have a regulation. It may or may not be the final one. We then look at, okay, how do members participate in this process as, one of many voices potentially in that comment process. And what's interesting about members of Congress and what makes them sort of unique among commenters and sets them aside from, if I could go and comment on a Department of Labor rule if I wanted to, is that they use their, again, informal, but I think powerful leverage to make procedural comments, to raise procedural objections, specifically things like, I think you should provide more information about this. I think you should hold another hearing. I think you should extend the comment deadline so that more people can have their voices heard. And oftentimes those requests are granted. What we find is those procedural objections, which are usually sort of described in very democratic terms, right? We want to hear from more people, and we want my constituents deserve the right to weigh in on this rule. Are systematically weighted towards members that are likely to disagree with the rule in the first place. So they're essentially slowing down or delaying the approval of the final rule by raising these procedural objections. So that's the one finding. The other interesting finding is that those kinds of objections, which I think that on first glance, people may not know that members are able to do this and often get this. I think that this is, you have to be pretty into the weeds of regulating to know that sometimes the agencies grant these kinds of procedural requests. They tend to be concentrated among members who have more experienced staff. It's the staffers who have been there longer, who are paid more, who presumably have the expertise to be able to say, oh, well, we could ask for this in addition to our comment that says this rule is bad, and then get a partial win, by at least delaying it.
So delay is usually what they get, or can they kill it, or can they just delay it?
I think that delay is the best success that you could get, that you could trace directly to a member. If an agency decides to back down on a rule or significantly modify it, especially for the ones that are important, there's too many forces going at once to just attribute it to the action of the member. But procedurally, I think, holding an extra hearing, maybe, in Kentucky or in Tennessee or something like that, that's a reasonable thing that happens.
See, I'm quite surprised that this can even happen, right? I mean, a member of Congress telling a regulator, having an impact on what a regulator does, their decision-making, right? Then action. And just the same with the oversight that you described previously, where a member calls up and gets an answer on the phone where the average citizen can't. To me, that is a surprising situation. I mean, I would think with separation of powers, the executive branch would be like, look, if you want to talk to me through legislation, right? Or call me up in a hearing using subpoena power to get information. I'm surprised that this kind of communication can even exist.
Well, they pay attention. I mean, I've talked to a couple dozen of these folks, and they're quite frank about this. They're aware. They know who has power in Congress. They know what the consequences are to ignore these people. A couple of one of the comments in our data is a request for a hearing in Kentucky by Mitch McConnell, which Mitch McConnell who already hates you asks you for this mild concession, yeah, and it's not that hard to placate it, right? To hold an additional hearing where maybe somebody you send is going to get yelled at. But it's a potential way to show them, this is a good faith effort to listen to your concerns. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's like you said, like maybe it's not ideal, but it is kind of a predictable feature of an institution which unevenly distributes power amongst its members.
Well, but their power is really only in the legislative aspect of things, right? So, I guess they can call them in for a hearing and it would be unpleasant, right? They can get funding cut. That's what they're afraid of, or they can change the makeup of their program. Those are the consequences, I guess, they're ultimately afraid of.
Or they could saddle them with political leadership, an appointee they really don't like.
Interesting. So, I mean, this kind of gets to, I guess, the last bit of your work that maybe we can discuss today, which is this, inner branch communications structure, power. So can you talk more about what you've done, doing research in this area? How does Congress relate to the other branches, and what are the various good things and pathologies that lie in there?
Sure. So I have a project right now with Christian Fong that is funded by the Sunwater Institute, which examines oversight in hearings and oversight of executive branch officials who appear in hearings. And what we're essentially trying to do is put a little meat on some of the existing measures of oversight that we have, which are mostly focused on counting quantities. How often do the hearings happen? How often do calls happen? What I think we know a lot less about are some of the things that practitioners actually want to know, right? So, which members of Congress are better or worse at extracting information from the executive branch? To answer that question, you have to have measures of their quality or their performance in the hearings. I was talking about staff and staff quality before. Most of the measures of staff quality that we have that people are working with, or staff or congressional capacity, is based solely on pay, which gets you somewhere, and or pay or tenure. Right? That's not nothing. But ideally, we'd like to know, what does the staffer, what is their actual expertise? How well are they trained? And do they have experience conducting the kind of oversight that you're talking about, Matt? So we have two projects. One is about measuring the quality of the oversight in hearings, and then the other is more about congressional staff. So we're using the administrative records, some of which the Sunwater Institute is collecting as well, to look at the career trajectories of essentially people who become oversight investigators, right? When do they elect to become trained by folks like the Levin Center and Pogo and the Lugar Center? And then do they stay in Congress for very long? And ultimately, our hope is to take the two projects and merge them and say, okay, once you get congressional staff who have been taught over a couple days how to conduct oversight, does your members' oversight behavior then change, right? And the reason I like that is that institutes like this one and others, if there is going to be a solution to the ills that people identify from Congress, it's most likely going to come from this nonprofit sector that is more philanthropic, that has programs which are ultimately going to be voluntary for congressional staff and members. And this is the kind of evidence that you would need to say, okay, how likely is that going to be successful, and what kinds of things could you do to make improvements at the margins?
And have you been able to, what's the result so far? Have you made progress? Is it difficult? Are you able to really differentiate between which ones are stronger, which ones are weaker? You know, how difficult a process is that?
It's a very difficult process. On the hearing side of things, you know, there's lots of data headaches, as you well know, on both the staff data and hearing data side of things. But what we found so far is a couple of things that tell us we're sort of onto something. One is that there is a lot of variation in terms of, you know, which member, how members behave, right? Some members are really well prepared. They get things out of witnesses. They can be quite confrontational and, you know, make witnesses look bad. And some members do have this skill. Some members don't do this. You know, some members either don't appear at all, which is more common, or they'll just, you know, sort of state their opinion and not be very fact-based. So, you know, if you talk to anybody who works in Congress, they know this intuitively, right? They know that some members are really sharp about this, or in this setting, and some are not, or just have a different style. So that's good. The other thing that we've found so far is that the scores that we're developing appear to be responsive to the kinds of things that we would expect them to be. So the interesting finding that we have so far is we've looked specifically at the presidential transition from Bush to Obama. And we found that if you look at the behavior of Democrats and Republicans in that time, you will see them behaving less confrontationally once Obama takes office, Democrats that is, and vice versa for Republicans. What's interesting to us, though, is that over that same time period, the amount of information, the aggregate amount of information, does not go down. So that's actually kind of a good story, right? We would worry that and this is something that scholars have worried about, is that the partisan citizens or incentives are so overriding that you're actually degrading both the quantity and the quality of the oversight. And that doesn't seem to be the case.
Great. Well, with that, maybe we can move on to the phase 2 of our discussion, where I ask you questions. I ask everybody else who come on the program, and see if all the answers line up or if people have divergent opinions. So are you ready to move on?
Sure. I didn't, you know, I should have got a spreadsheet together and made sure I was in line with my colleagues.
We haven't put the spreadsheet together ourselves yet, but that's part of the plan. So the first question on this line is, you know, what do you think congressional representation should mean? Are you a delegate person? Are you a Burkean? You know, where are you?
Yeah, I tend to be more, I think on the delegate trustee spectrum, I'm probably closer to trustee. That's in part because I also study the executive branch, so I have a lot of examples in my head of things that the public wanted that were not in its not necessarily in its interest for Congress to be doing, and you know, things that presidents, the you know, moments in my head of great moments in American history often involve a single someone, usually a president, making a decision that was politically costly and unpopular, but was necessarily better for the country. So, yeah.
So you think representatives should make their own judgments? You lean towards that over for what's in the best interest of their constituency. Yeah. And by the constituency, I'm assuming, or I shouldn't assume, do you mean, you know, is it the primary voters, the constituency? Is it all the voters? Is it the majority voters? Is it everybody in the district? Is it the citizen? You know, who is the actual constituency of a member?
I think ideally it would be everyone in your district.
All right, so we got everybody. And how about the future? So, there's people currently alive and voting, and then there are the generations in the future that will live in that district. Are their interests captured by the representative, or is the representative just representing the people who are alive today, and channeling those future people through the living constituents?
Yeah, this is the first time we've touched on, the nascent intergenerational conflict that, has not happened yet, but potentially could. Yeah. Again, I would say ideally that you would be representing future interests as well. One of the things that I tell I do a basic fact sheet for all my students about Social Security, and then illustrate to them that people who are collecting Social Security vote at a rate 3 times their generation, but are roughly this equal size, and then invite them to imagine the counterfactual of that fact being reversed, and then think about what Social Security would look like if that were the case.
Well, that's the quintessential example, right?
Right.
Where there's wealth transfer from one group to another, right, based on generation. All right, great. So we'll go to the next question. How would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And by this, I mean in DC versus in the district, legislation versus oversight, campaigning versus working in, their hired job. Where do you come down on those things?
I think probably so. Rattling off the things that you said, more time in DC relative to their district. I think the feedback that they get in their district is almost always tilted and not terribly informative. If we're still talking about the ideal interests and the ideal Congress, whether it's strategic is beside the point. As far as the other things go, I think the thing that I'd say on this is the whole point. I think that the ideal Congress would allocate its time in a way that returns to a more specialized Congress, one where the committees actually perform a function and people actually specialize, and they actually have power. So I think that a more efficiently Congress that has more efficiently allocated time divides itself many times over so that it can, in effect, have more time.
Do you believe they should move their families back and live in DC full time?
I think that's more of a personal. I have no idea. It certainly seems to be. I mean, it's the nature of DC that representatives from Maryland have a lot easier time of it. My congressman was from Southern California, so that was quite the trip to go back and forth. So yeah, I'm not sure about that.
All right. Next one is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Should it be on the floor? Should it be in the committee? Should it be in dark rooms? Should it be transparent? Should it be private?
Okay. So again, we're getting into sort of pipe dream territory. More, I think, committee. So in keeping with what I was saying before, debate within committees is better. It's more informed. It's more concentrated. It's easier because there's smaller people, or there's smaller number of people. Now, should it be open or transparent? I think I go back and forth on this. I think that, in line with some of what I found in my own research, sometimes I think it would be better for there to be less transparency, at least in real time. One of the things that the members of Congress that I have talked to who have served in the contemporary Congress say is that the chasing of sound bites is a real problem. And, if you could imagine a Congress where it is transparent, it releases a transcript of all of its proceedings, but those proceedings come out 3 weeks from now, I think that solves that problem pretty quickly. So, some balance between, the opacity that you would need to sort of cure us of this need to grab attention, which some members play to their own advantage quite well, while balancing the fact that it is a public body that is a representative of the citizens of the United States and should be held to account for the things that they say and do.
Got it. All right, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within a 50-year timeframe?
Fundamental institutional improvement. If we're going to stick with this, I'd probably stick with this, the theme of oversight, just to narrow this down a little bit. If we cannot get a constitutional amendment that says very clearly that Congress has the right to any and all information from the executive branch, I think that it would be good for Congress to improve its own ability to enforce its subpoenas and other information gathering tools. So people talk about the establishment of a kind of independent counsel office that is not within the purview of the president. They talk about establishing a specialized court to review subpoenas and consider them on a fast track basis. I think either of those things would be very helpful. The system that we have now, where oversight conflicts at the highest level are now playing out in civil litigation that takes years and effectively makes the oversight useless, is not good. It's another, highlights another instance where, the norm among executive branch officials in the past had been to capitulate and not go to court and fight these. That norm seems to either be dead or dying. So the institutions need to adapt to them.
Got it. Next one is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Sure. Congressional reform. So there's a book by David Epstein and Sharon O'Halloran called Delegating Powers. That is about, it was influential for me because it is about how often Congress relies on the executive branch. It contains a measure, basically measures within major pieces of legislation, provisions of law that give agencies discretion, and then quantitatively shows, the procedures and rules that Congress builds in to sort of build in checks on the use of that discretion. So that's been, informed pretty much all of my thinking about the executive branch and oversight since then, because the whole, even just seeing that, that's essentially the water that they're swimming in. It's a circumstance where they are in most ways dependent on officials with discretion to carry out their laws, right? That's their problem. That's the problem they have to solve. Has been hugely influential for me and for a lot of other people.
Right. Well, the last question is really about your own personal research. What's your plan in the short term, and in the long run, what are you going to focus on?
Well, in the short term, I'm trying to finish up these oversight projects, or at least get them out there. In the longer term, I think that both the oversight projects I mentioned about the training and about the hearings there'll be very much demonstrations of what is possible. And the question will be, well, how do you scale that kind of research going forward? Right, there are lots of people that train congressional staffers. I only have a small universe of that. And we only have a small universe of hearings that will be coded. So there's that. I'm also writing a book about presidential power, which touches on oversight because part of the story and part of the, the backdrop of the aggrandizement of the executive over the previous 3 decades. It's really a story of the decline of Congress's policymaking capacity. So I'm going to finish that book. I'm going to try to finish those articles and eventually scale them further.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Lowande, for your work, and looking forward to the future books and the outcomes of that hearing work.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for having me. And yeah, this has been great.
Been a pleasure. Take care.